Hello, my name is Rakesh Sharma. I'm the Director for Monitoring and Evaluation and Survey Research at IFES in Washington, D.C. I'm here to present the findings from IFES's latest survey in Ukraine. This is the 25th survey that IFES has conducted in Ukraine, and it presents some interesting trend findings on social, political, and economic views of the Ukrainian people. This survey was conducted between September 12 and 26, 2015, in all areas of Ukraine outside of Crimea and Donbas. So it is representative of the views of Ukrainians outside of Donbas and Crimea. The survey sample size was 1,558 respondents, and the margin of error for a survey of this size is plus or minus 2.5%. This survey finds that Ukrainians are more pessimistic about the situation in the country in this survey than they were 1 year ago in the September 2014 survey in Ukraine. When we ask Ukrainian the direction in which Ukraine is headed, we find in this survey that 56% think that Ukraine is headed in the wrong direction and 20% think it is headed in the right direction. So comparing the data from the September 2014 survey to the September 2015 survey, we find that the percentage of Ukrainians who think Ukraine is headed in the wrong direction has risen by 14%, and the percentage who think it is headed in the right direction has fallen by 14%. When we ask Ukrainians about the biggest issues facing Ukraine, we find the war in Donbas and economic issues receiving high levels of mentions. 70% mention the Donbas conflict, 56% mention inflation, 42% mention poverty, 35% unemployment, and 30% general economic problems. Corruption is mentioned by 53% of the population. Interestingly, when you compare the September 2014 survey to this survey, you find economic mentions increasing significantly. For example, inflation was mentioned by 38% in September 2014. It is now mentioned by 56%. When we ask Ukrainians with their experience with corruption, we find that a significant percentage of Ukrainians have had some level of experience with corruption over the past 12 months. When we ask people about their experience with certain types of corruption, we find that 32% say that they've had to pay a bribe in order to be seen in a hospital or clinic over the past 12 months. 9% have had to pay a money above what is required by law to process a document. 8% have been asked to pay a bribe at work, and 8% have also been asked to pay a bribe at school. When we combine all this data together, we find that 40% of Ukrainians have experienced some form of corruption over the past 12 months. This compares to 37% in the April 2014 survey. This data seems to indicate that the level of corruption and experience with corruption has increased by a small but significant amount in Ukraine over the past year. The survey also finds that while Ukrainians continue to hold high aspirations for Ukraine, they are disappointed in how their current leadership has met these aspirations over the past 2 years. When we asked Ukrainians what the aspirations of Maidan were, there are a number of different mentions. Over 60% mentioned the reduction of corruption as one of the reasons that Maidan took place. Over 50% mentioned demand for greater integration of Ukraine with Europe. Over 40% mentioned the limiting the influence of oligarchs on Ukraine's political process. Close to 40% mentioned having a country with liberal values where all people are equally protected. And over 30% also mentioned reforms of the judiciary and law enforcement agencies, while just over 20% mentioned more democracy in Ukraine. These responses seem to suggest that Ukrainians see Maidan as a movement that was primarily concerned with public integrity in governance and with more liberal and democratic values for Ukraine. But when we ask Ukrainians whether there has been any improvement on these aspirations of Maidan over the past 2 years, we find that Ukrainians have very skeptical attitudes. A clear majority think that there has not been any improvement or much improvement in the equality of all Ukrainians, in the fight against corruption, in the reform of the judiciary, and in limiting the influence of oligarchs on Ukraine's political process. And the majority also do not believe that there has been much or any improvement in the protection of Ukraine's national culture, in Ukraine's economic and political integration with Europe, or with democracy in Ukraine. The survey finds that there is still strong support for a democratic system and liberal values in Ukraine. When we ask Ukrainians about their preferred political system, 49% say that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. 21% say that in certain situations a non-democratic government can be preferable. And 16% say that to them it does not matter what form of government Ukraine has. The percentage who prefer democracy has declined since the September 2014 survey, when 65% preferred democracy over any other form of government. Yet, it is significantly higher than what we observed in IFES surveys before Maidan. For example, in the October 2013 survey, only 38% said that democracy was preferable to any other form of government. The preference for democracy is also indicated by some other data on the survey. We asked Ukrainians to choose between two different statements. The first said it should be a priority for Ukraine to pursue economic development, even if it means foregoing some democratic rights. The second statement said Ukraine's priority should be to maintain democratic rights for its citizens, even if this means the economy develops slowly. In this survey, 42% prioritized democracy, 37% prioritize economic development. This is significantly different than the October 2013 survey, in which 36% prioritized economic development and 30% prioritized democracy. A greater percentage of Ukrainians in all regions of the country prioritize democracy over economic development, with the exception of the South. In the south of the country, 62% prioritize economic development and 24% prioritize democratic rights. When we combine the data on questions on democracy in the survey, we can create a profile of the Ukrainian population. The population is divided into three groups: those with a strong attachment to democracy, those with a weak attachment to democracy, and those who have mixed opinions. In this survey, 41% have a strong attachment to democracy, 35% have a weak attachment to democracy, and 24% have mixed opinions. In the October 2013 survey, 33% had a strong attachment to democracy and 38% had a weak attachment to democracy. The percentage with a strong attachment to democracy has increased by 8% from the October 2013 survey to the September 2015 survey, indicating that there is stronger support for democracy in Ukraine at this time, even with the bad economic situation and general skepticism about the situation in the country. This does not, however, mean that Ukrainians are satisfied with the way democracy works in Ukraine. Only 15% are satisfied, while more than 50% are dissatisfied with the way democracy works in Ukraine. We also see this in another question on democracy in Ukraine. We ask people, how much of a democracy is Ukraine today? Only 2% say that Ukraine is a full democracy. 19% say that Ukraine is a democracy but with minor problems, whereas 43% say that Ukraine is a democracy but with major problems. 23% say Ukraine is not a democracy at all. So even though a majority of people in Ukraine think that it is a democracy in some respect, 43% think it has major problems, and indicates that people are not happy with the way democracy is being practiced in the country. The view that Ukraine is a democracy is a plurality view in all regions of the country. In the West, 49% believe that Ukraine is a democracy, but it has major problems. The same view is shared by 43% in the north and Kyiv, 42% in the center, 44% in the south, and 34% in the east outside of Donbas. Ukrainians also prefer closer relations with Europe than they do with Russia. When we ask people whether it would be better for Ukraine if it had closer political and economic relations with Europe or Russia, 49% in this survey say that Ukraine would be better off with closer relations with Europe. Only 8% select Russia. 19% think Ukraine would be better off with closer relations with both Europe and Russia, and 14% say neither. It is interesting to compare the views on this question in this survey versus the September 2012 survey in Ukraine. In that survey, 33% preferred closer relations with Europe and 29% preferred closer relations with Russia. Support for closer relations with Russia has fallen slowly since that time to the low levels we see in this survey. Looking at this question on a regional basis for this survey, we see wide discrepancy between the different regions. 71% in the West prefer closer relations with Europe, 51% in the north and Kyiv, and 48% in the center of the country. Support for closer relations with Europe is slightly lower in the east and in the south. In the south, 30% prefer closer relations with Europe, 14% with Russia, while 24% would prefer closer relations with both. In the east, 29% prefer closer relations with Europe, 16% with Russia, while 34% would prefer closer relations with both. The survey finds that there is low level of confidence in most political leaders in the country. When asked about the level of confidence in their leaders, 32% say that they have a great deal or fair amount of confidence in President Poroshenko, while 62% say they don't have much or any confidence in him. Only 20% say that they have confidence in Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, whereas 75% say they lack confidence in him. 25% have confidence in Klitschko, 25% in Tymoshenko, 23% in Lutsenko, and 22% in Parubi. There is higher level of confidence in political institutions in the country. 74% have confidence in the Ukrainian military. 63% have confidence in the media based in Ukraine. And 52% have confidence in the newly created Ukrainian police. The survey also finds that there is generally higher confidence in local officials than in regional or national officials. 47% have confidence in the mayor of their city. 47% also have confidence in their city or village council. By comparison, only 19% have confidence in the cabinet of ministers and 19% in the Verkhovna Rada. A primary reason for the low levels of confidence in current political leaders is the lack of activity in the aspirations of Maidan. We gave respondents several statements about Maidan and the current leadership's actions on Maidan and asked them to agree or disagree. Only 38% agree that our current political leaders understand the reforms that are needed to address the aspirations of the second Maidan. 47% disagree. Even lower, only 28% agree that although the going has been slow, our current political leaders will ensure that needed reforms are introduced. 51% disagree with this statement. Given the low level of confidence in political leaders and their low level of activity when it comes to Maidan, it is not surprising that 72% agree that the only way the objectives of the Maidan can be achieved is through a new generation of leaders not tied to the status quo. These survey findings indicate that Ukrainians primarily associate Maidan with liberal values and integrity in governance. And while they have been disappointed with their current leaders' actions on these priorities, they still manage to have strong support for democracy and with closer integration with Europe and Western values. Given these findings from the survey, it is imperative that the current political leadership in Ukraine accelerate the reform agenda so that the aspirations of the Ukrainian people can be met. For more information on this survey, please visit our page at ifes.org.